Twisting and turning a hand crank in unison, the 7 men pushed the submarine onward. The first of its nature and arguably one of the biggest developments of the 19th century. Waves crashed into the slow-moving, sleek submarine as she creeped toward her target under cover of darkness, ready to become a part of history and be the first submarine to ever sink a warship. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for our younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Thank you to our YouTube members for picking this episode. H.L. Hunley, also called CSS Hunley, CSS Hunley, or simply the Hunley, was a submarine of the Confederate States of America that played a small yet crucial part in the American Civil War. She was named for her inventor, Horace Lawson Hunley. Shortly after, she was recruited into government service for the Confederate States Army at Charleston, South Carolina. She did have a couple predecessors, and we'll briefly look at them first. Horace Lawson Hunley provided funding for James McClintock to design 3 submarines, and they would be Pioneer, built in New Orleans, American Diver, built in Mobile, and the Hunley, also in Mobile. During this time, the United States Navy was constructing their own submarine called USS Alligator, and in late 1861 the Confederacy was working on theirs. Hunley, McClintock, and a third man named Baxter Watson first built Pioneer, testing her in February of 1862 in the Mississippi River, and she was later towed to Lake Pontchartrain for more trials. Due to the Union advancing on New Orleans, the men abandoned her development and she was scuttled the next month, crossing Pioneer off the list. They concluded that they could improve another submarine and moved on to Mobile to develop their second project, American Diver. They experimented with several different methods of self-propulsion, including McClintock's electromagnetic drive, followed by a custom steam engine, but eventually they settled on a simple hand-cranked propulsion system as they deemed that trying to implement a different engine would be a waste of time and money. American Diver was then ready for harbor trials in January of 1863. However, she was too slow to be useful. Despite this fact, she was towed down to the bay to Fort Morgan and attempted an attack on the Union blockade in the area. However, she foundered in the rough waters because of the currents at the mouth of Mobile Bay, combined with foul weather, and she sank, though her crew did manage to escape. American Diver was never recovered, and that scratches her off our list as well. Shortly after the loss of American Diver, construction on the Hunley began in Mobile, Alabama. Before we get any further into her story, let's look at her specs. She was 39.5 feet long, had a beam of 3.83 feet wide, and displaced 7.5 short tons. She was propelled by a hand-cranked ducted propeller and traveled at a maximum speed of 4 knots. As for her complement, this submarine was serviced by 6 enlisted with 2 officers, and had 1 spar torpedo for armament. This spar torpedo was a copper cylinder containing 135 pounds of black powder that was attached to a 22-foot-long wooden spar. The spar was to be used when the submarine was 6 feet or more below the surface, and then the Hunley would ram the spar with the torpedo into the side of the target vessel to attach it to the target. It would then immediately explode, supposedly, though there has been some evidence of a possible electronic detonation with spools of copper wire and components for a battery being discovered recently, though this still isn't confirmed. In the earliest stages of her development, she was called the fish boat, the fish torpedo boat, or the porpoise. Legend has it that she was constructed from a cast-off steam boiler, and this is perhaps because of a cutaway drawing by William Alexander who had seen her, and this showed a short, stubby little thing. However, in actuality, Hunley was very sleek and modern-looking, with the 1902 drawing by R.G. Scarrett a more accurate representation. Each end of the submarine was equipped with ballast tanks that could be flooded by valves or pumped dry by hand pumps. Extra ballast was added using iron weights bolted to the underside of the hull, though if she needed extra buoyancy in an emergency, the iron weight could be removed by unscrewing the heads of the bolts from inside the vessel. The 2 hatches were accessible through the conning tower located in the forward and aft sections of the submarine, and they are estimated to have been 16.5 inches in width and 21 inches in length. The cramped quarters and small hatches made entering, exiting, and maneuvering inside the vessel incredibly difficult and uncomfortable. Hunley was designed for a crew of 8, with 7 turning the hand crank ducted propeller and 1 to steer and direct the boat. The crew would sit shoulder to shoulder in this cramped, hot environment and tirelessly work to propel the submarine. The submarine was the first of her kind. And we are one of a kind over here. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Okay, my friends, let's look more into her career. By July of 1863, Hunley was ready for a demonstration. During this demonstration that was supervised by Confederate Admiral Franklin Buchanan, Hunley successfully attacked a coal flatboat in Mobile Bay. After this, on August 29, 1863, she was packed onto a train and shipped to Charleston, South Carolina. She was then seized by the Confederate Army sometime shortly after this, and she would then operate as a Confederate Army vessel from then on, though sometimes Horace Hunley and his partners would remain involved in her further testing and operation. While she was sometimes called CSS Hunley, she was never formally commissioned into service. Confederate Navy Lieutenant John A. Payne of CSS Chicora volunteered himself to be Hunley's captain, and 7 men from CSS Palmetto State and CSS Chicora volunteered to be her first crew. On August 29, 1863, Hunley's new crew was prepping for a test dive when Lieutenant Payne accidentally stepped on the lever controlling the sub's diving planes as she was still running on the surface. This caused her to dive with one of the hatches still open, filling with water. Payne and 2 others managed to escape, but unfortunately, the other 5 men drowned. The Confederate Army officially took control of the situation from here on out, with all orders for her coming directly from General P.G.T. Beauregard, and Lieutenant George E. Dixon was in command of her now. She would unfortunately sink again after failing to surface from a mock attack on October 15, 1863, killing all 8 of her second crew, including Horace Hunley himself. He was aboard despite the fact that he was not a member of the Confederate military, though he might have taken Dixon's place for the test dive. She was raised once more and returned to service. On the evening of February 17, 1864, H.L. Hunley made her first mission against an enemy vessel during the American Civil War. Armed with her spar torpedo mounted to the wooden spar on her bow, she was heading in to lift the blockade of Charleston, South Carolina by destroying USS Housatonic in Charleston Harbor. This was no easy feat. Housatonic was a 1,240 long-ton sloop of war with an armament of 12 large cannons. A sloop of war was a warship of the British Royal Navy with a single gun deck that carried up to 18 guns, and they were typically used during the 18th and 19th centuries. Housatonic was stationed at the entrance of Charleston Harbor, roughly 5 miles off the east coast of the United States. She was commanded by Captain Charles W. Pickering and had a crew of 150 men aboard. H.L. Hunley, still commanded by Dixon, began her approach at about 8:45 p.m., creeping along at 4 knots. There's some debate about what exactly happened with the approach, but what we do know is that H.L. Hunley was sighted just before embedding her torpedo into Housatonic's hull. Official accounts recall Housatonic being incapable of firing a broadside at Hunley and only hitting her with small arms fire, which did very little if anything. Hunley attached the torpedo and then reversed, setting off for home. A few moments after this, the torpedo exploded and sank Housatonic. First-hand reports say that no explosion was heard by the crew, who immediately started to climb the rigging or get into lifeboats as the ship began to sink stern first and list to port. Within 5 minutes, she was partially underwater, taking 2 officers and 3 crewmen down with her and injuring an unknown number of sailors. Hunley had done it. She was the first combat submarine to ever sink a warship. The survivors of Housatonic were later rescued by other ships of the Charleston blockading force. The first ship on scene was USS Canandaigua. Despite the victory dance Hunley's crew might have had, it was short-lived. She was due back at Sullivan's Island later and never returned to base. There are theories stating that she might have sunk from the explosion of her own torpedo, but we may never know for certain. At one point, there might have been evidence that Hunley survived as long as 1 full hour after the attack, meaning she would have sunk around 9:45 p.m. The day after the attack, The commander of Battery Marshall reported he had received the signals from the submarine indicating she was returning to base. The report didn't clarify what these signals were. However, a post-war correspondent wrote that, quote, 2 blue lights were the prearranged signals, and a lookout aboard Housatonic reported seeing a blue light on the water after his ship sank. Blue light in 1864's talk was referring to a pyrotechnic signal in long use by the U.S. Navy, and it was not a blue lantern with a blue lens like some reports previously stated. Pyrotechnic blue light could be easily seen over the 4-mile distance between Battery Marshall and where the Hunley attacked Housatonic. We don't know Dixon's exact plan, though it could have been to take his submarine underwater to make a return to Sullivan's Island. At one point, the finders of Hunley suggested that she might have been unintentionally rammed by USS Canandaigua when that ship came to rescue the crew of Housatonic, but no such evidence was found when she was later raised. Instead, all evidence and analysis points to the instantaneous death of Hunley's entire crew at the moment of the spar torpedo's contact with the hull of Housatonic. After clearing out all of the silt from inside the hull, the skeletons of the crew members were found seated at their stations with no signs of skeletal trauma. In October of 2008, scientists reported that they had found that the crew of Hunley hadn't set her pump to remove water from their compartment, so this possibly indicated that she wasn't flooded until after they had already died. In January 2013, an announcement was made that conservator Paul Mardikian had found evidence of a copper sleeve at the end of Hunley's spar. This finding shows that the torpedo had been attached directly to the spar, meaning the submarine might have been within 16 feet from Housatonic when the torpedo exploded. In 2018, more evidence was found that the keel blocks, which the crew could release from inside the vessel to allow the sub to surface quickly in an emergency, were still attached. Based upon evidence that the crew died instantly with no struggle to survive, and the short distance between the torpedo and the vessel itself has led a team of blast trauma specialists from Duke University to theorize that the Hunley's crew was killed by the explosion, which could have transmitted pressure waves inside the vessel without damaging its hull. The research included scaled experiments with live black powder bombs, and this provided data that indicated the crew was more than likely killed by the explosion and immediate pulmonary blast trauma that resulted from it. There are some researchers that disagree, but this is the most likely scenario. Years after Hunley went missing, the area around the wreck of Housatonic was surveyed, and the Hunley was discovered on the seaward side of the sloop, where no one had considered looking before. This later indicated that the ocean current was going outward following the attack on Housatonic, carrying Hunley to where she eventually was recovered. She awaited discovery for a long time on the bottom of the ocean, eventually being rescued and her story being picked by our YouTube members. This episode couldn't be possible without our amazing YouTube members and patrons. Thank you all so much. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Okay friends, it's time to look at the recovery and conservation of her wreckage. There's a little bit of legal tea here as well, so I hope you've brought a snack. Hunley's discovery has been described by the Director of Naval History at the Naval Historical Center, William Dudley, as, quote, probably the most important find of the century. While some of us may not agree, we can all agree that finding her was an incredibly important part of American naval history. The discovery itself has some legal tea associated with it that we will cover in a little bit, since it's been claimed by two very well-known individuals in the ship community, E. Lee Spence and Clive Cussler. More than likely, Spence discovered the Hunley originally in 1970, as he's provided a collection of evidence to validate this, including a 1980 Civil Admiralty case. The court took the position that the wreck was outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. Marshal's Office, and no determination of ownership was made. On September 13, 1976, the National Park Service submitted the location provided by the Sea Research Society, which is owned by Spence, for the Hunley for inclusion on the National Register of Historic Places. Spence's location for Hunley became a matter of public record at this point when she was officially approved on December 29, 1978. Spence released a book called Treasures of the Confederate Coast in January of 1995, and in this book he included a chapter on the discovery of Hunley, complete with a map of the area and an X marking where her wreckage was. Here's where it gets messy, y'all. Diver Ralph Wilbanks located the wreck once more in April of 1995 while leading a NUMA dive team originally organized by archaeologist Mark Newell and funded by novelist Clive Cussler, and Cussler announced the find as a new discovery. He first claimed that the location was in about 18 feet of water over 1 mile inshore of Housatonic, but later admitted to a reporter that that was false. The wreck was actually 100 yards away from and on the seaward side of Housatonic in 27 feet of water, right where Spence said it was. The submarine was buried under several feet of silt, which had concealed and protected her for over 100 years. The divers exposed the forward hatch and the ventilator box, which was the air box for the attachment of her twin snorkels, to identify her. She was resting on her starboard side in the sand at about a 45-degree angle, and was covered in 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch thick incrustation of rust bonded with sand and seashell particles. Archaeologists swept away silt to expose her port side and bow dive plane, with more digging revealing her to be about 37 feet long, and the entirety of the vessel was well preserved under the sediment. Ready for it to really start getting messy? Well, Spence heard about this whole ordeal and felt how you might have expected. Shortly after the Hunley was donated to the state of South Carolina on September 14, 1995, NUMA disclosed to government officials where Wilbanks' location for the wreck was, which matched Spence's 1970s slot of the wreck's location well within standard mapping tolerances. Spence reminded everyone that he discovered Hunley in 1970, revisiting and remapping the site in 1971 and again in 1979, and he published the location in his 1995 book, expecting NUMA to independently verify the wreck as Hunley, not to claim that they'd discovered her. NUMA was actually a part of a South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology expedition directed by Dr. Mark M. Newell and not Cussler. Dr. Newell swore under oath that he used Spence's maps to direct the joint expedition and credited Spence with the discovery. He credits his own expedition with merely official verification, and that was it. With this expedition and everything going on with Hunley, she was raised on August 8, 2000. She was well documented, investigated, and measured before her removal from the ocean, hoisted up by Carlissa B. At 8:37 a.m. that morning, she broke from the surface for the first time in more than 136 years, greeted by a cheering crowd on shore, including Clive Cussler, who was aboard another vessel nearby. She was then shipped back to Charleston, and she was secured inside the Warren Lash Conservation Center, in a specially designed tank of fresh water to await conservation. She is now on display at the Warren Lash Conservation Center, and there are also artifacts from inside Hunley and exhibits about the submarine here. Let's get into the lawsuit because yes, there was one. In 2001, Clive Cussler filed a lawsuit against E. Lee Spence for unfair competition, injurious falsehood, civil conspiracy, and defamation. All difficult things to prove in a court of law considering the evidence. Spence filed a countersuit against Cussler in 2002 seeking damages, claiming that Cussler was engaging in unfair competition, civil conspiracy, and tortious interference by claiming Cussler had discovered the location of the wreck of Hunley in 1995 when she'd already been discovered by Spence in 1970. He went on to further state that these claims by Cussler were damaging to his career and cost him damages over $100,000. Spence's lawsuit would be dismissed through a summary judgment in 2007 on the theory that under the Lanham Act, regardless of the nature of Cussler's claims, Cussler had been making them for over 3 years, and therefore the statute of limitations in order to sue was well over. Cussler would drop his lawsuit as well a year later, after the judge agreed that Spence could introduce evidence in support of his discovery claims as a truth defense against Cussler's claims against him. I really admire Cussler and enjoy his books, but this was just not a good move for him. H.L. Hunley brought into question all that was possible on the seas, and changed the way we think about naval warfare. Rest in peace to her crew, as they made the ultimate sacrifice in times of war. Regardless of their views and which side of the war they were fighting on, they were still on the right side of naval developments and helped propel us into the next century of naval warfare. If you liked that story and wanted to hear something similar, check out our Mississippi River ships playlist in the cards. Next week, we get into the story of SS Rex, a beautiful Italian ocean liner that was attacked by the Royal Air Force during World War II. Thank you for tuning into Shipwreck Sunday, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.